Hello, everyone. It's very nice to be here with you. Thank you for joining us for another presentation from Tech Contracts Academy. My usual colleague for these talks on LinkedIn, Kathy O'Sullivan, couldn't be here today, so I am winging it on my own. Before we dive in, just a couple of sort of housekeeping announcements to talk through what we're doing and where we're going. So we're going to be talking today about the 4 misunderstood types of technology deals and the terms that they need. And we'll go about 25 minutes, roughly speaking. Housekeeping point, while I am an attorney, I'm not this conversation is for general purposes, general interest, and so it is not legal advice, and you shouldn't rely on it as legal advice. In fact, you should be aware that legal situations differ greatly. So if you have a legal issue, you need to talk to an attorney about that issue specifically. So keep in mind, too, this conversation is being recorded, and that would include any comments that you put in the comment section. Those comments are very welcome. And in fact, I may have the opportunity to address comments later on after the program. So please do go ahead and put in comments and questions, and hopefully this will lead to a lively discussion. So, okay, so let's dive into our topic. And as I said, that's the 4 types of information technology contracts and the terms that they lead to. And most importantly, the misunderstandings that are typical around those 4 types of contracts. And so, I think this starts with a question: why is it important in the first place to get your head around these 4 types? Why is it so important to understand what these 4 types of contracts are? Can't we just dive into each set of negotiations, each deal, based on what we learn about that deal? The reason is the mistakes that I run into, both practicing technology law and doing deals, and working with my students as a trainer through Tech Contracts Academy and an instructor at UC Berkeley Law student, and serving as an expert witness, which I do about cases about tech contracts. In all of those contexts, the mistakes that I run into are very, very often about misunderstanding the type of the deal, about thinking, for instance, that a cloud services deal is an on-premise software deal. Mistakes along those lines lead to all kinds of errors. And I'd say, I don't know, maybe half of the errors that we see arise out of these mistakes. And it's a consistent set of mistakes. And that's why I say it's probably not adequate to just say, well, I'm going to figure out what kind of deal I'm working on each time. There are consistent errors made again and again based on misunderstanding these 4 types of tech contracts that I'm going to go into. So you're preparing yourself for almost any type of deal by getting a handle on these 4 types of contracts. So that leads to the obvious question: what are the 4? What are we talking about? So the 4 types of tech contracts, as I would define it, are 1, on-premise software license agreements. So that's a deal where the customer gets the software on-premise. It gets to make a copy. And that's the key point, that an on-premise software deal, the customer gets to make a copy of the software and run it on some computer. Don't get hung up on the concept of premise. Don't get hung up on the idea, is it the customer's literal premise? Is it the customer's literal computer? The point is that the customer got to make a copy and use the copy. And whatever computer it's going to put it on, whether it's in the customer's office or house or a data center it's renting from somebody else, doesn't matter. The customer gets to put a copy on a computer. That's an on-premise software license, type number 1. Type number 2, technology professional services. So simple enough, this is assistance provided by a human being, a service. So it might be programming, it might be technical support, it might be integration of some system into another system, might be technology architecture. Simple enough to understand, services provided by a human being. So those 2 aren't necessarily very complicated and confusing. You might be wondering what all the fuss is about. It's the next two set of categories that create all the confusion, and particularly in the way that they seem to overlap with the first two, or at least generate confusion with the first two. So type number 3 is probably the big one: cloud services agreements. I don't mean cloud computing exactly. Cloud computing is a technology infrastructure, and I'm not so much worried about the technology. I'm talking about a business model. Cloud services refers to a business model. It includes software as a service, platform as a service, infrastructure as a service, and you could define other sorts of technology as a service relationships as fitting that. The business model is that instead of the vendor giving the customer the technology for direct access, the vendor hosts the technology itself online, probably online, and the customer accesses it remotely. So, software as a service, for instance, is distinct from on-premise software in that the customer doesn't get the right to make a copy. It doesn't get a copyright license to make a copy because it doesn't need one, because the software is always going to sit on the vendor's computers. What the customer gets is remote access. And that's the same with platform as a service. Software as a service and platform as a service from a business point of view are very similar. Software as a service sort of classically refers to the software as an application, something humans use, and platform as a service, the software is it's a platform. It's software that you use to run other software on top or to build other software. But either way, it's software being provided remotely. Infrastructure as a service, the third main subcategory of cloud services, is where instead of providing software, the vendor provides infrastructure, computers. The reality is not a lot of infrastructure as a service providers just provide computers. There's some software on them. There's the concept of bare metal, which means it's really just computers, but there's always some kind of software on the computers. But anyway, infrastructure as a service is mostly about providing that hardware. So you're probably familiar with vendors of these types of systems. Salesforce, of course, is the classic software as a service provider, sort of really blazed trails on that front, while Amazon Web Services is probably the best known infrastructure as a service provider. You rent computers from them. So that's type 3. And type 3 is very often confused for type 1 or type 2, for on-premise software or for professional services. And I'll explain why. Type 4 is something we don't normally think about. I call it non-tech offerings delivered through technology, or maybe less of a handful, sometimes just less of a mouthful. Sometimes call it just edge of industry offerings. And what I mean by that is they're deals that actually aren't even about technology. You're not providing technology, you're providing something else. Marketing services, networking services, a marketplace to buy consumer goods, whatever it might be, but you're providing it through technology. So an example would be LinkedIn. Here we are on LinkedIn. Probably most of you are on LinkedIn for free, but LinkedIn's business is to monetize you. But they're not selling you technology, and they're not, giving you technology, in exchange for their other way of deriving revenue to put advertisements in front of you. Whatever they're selling, it isn't really the technology. You're here to buy networking and to buy marketing opportunities. That's what LinkedIn's business is. But LinkedIn provides that product, that service, a little hard to say which it is, through technology. Actually, I really think it's a service. It's a marketing and networking service. Or Facebook is very similar. It provides this networking and marketing service through technology. Or think of eBay. eBay doesn't sell technology. eBay gives you a place to go, a market. It provides a market for consumer goods and other products. But again, through technology. These edge of industry offerings, this fourth category, they're not really about providing technology, unlike cloud services, where it's the tech that's the point. But they're so tech heavy. They're so thoroughly ingrained and intertwined with technology in the way they're provided that they look like technology deals. Those are our 4 types. Again, on-premise software license agreements, IT professional services, cloud service, and edge of industry offerings that aren't really technology offerings, but use technology. And it's the first two, it's the last two that are regularly confused with the others. So let's dive into that. Why is that? What is the source of all this confusion? Let's start with cloud services. So in the olden days, through most of the 20th century, we didn't have cloud services, and most of us could easily sort of wrap our heads around the difference between the two main types of technology offerings, software or professional services. You don't have trouble telling the difference between those two. You're buying software, or at least a license to software, and you're going to put it on your computer and run it. Or you're buying help. You're getting someone who's going to provide tech support or going to do some programming for you or whatever. All simple enough. Then very late in the 20th century, software as a service came around. I was in a company in the late 90s that called ourselves an ASP, application service provider. It's sort of arguably means essentially the same thing as software as a service. That's an initial name for this, but the industry has settled on names like software as a service. So what's happening there is the vendor is, as I said, providing the technology to the customer, but no copy is given, no direct access. You can't put it on your own computer. Seems simple enough, but it leads to a lot of kind of head scratching issues. Like, for one, is this a product or a service? So there's a lot of confusion around that. And it's made worse by the fact that the industry chose terms that kind of use both words. I mean, software as a service, it sounds like a product and it sounds like a service. The reality is that software as a service deals and platform as a service deals and the other cloud services deals really look a lot more like product sales. They look more like on-premise software license deals. But the industry chose to use the word service again and again. And in fact, the IT industry uses that term in a confusing way. And that generates all kinds of confusion. That leads to confusion between software as a service deals and professional service deals. But the flip side of that confusion is that people also get confused between software as a service deals or other cloud service deals and software licensing. So as a result of the rise of cloud services, software as a service, et cetera, it was no longer really meaningful to talk about things like software agreements. What's a software agreement? That's when we started talking about on-premise software. What in the old days was just a software deal, a software license agreement. Now you're doing a lot better if you specify that you mean on-premise software to distinguish it from software as a service and other cloud services. So the outcome of adding this new model is confusion between the other two. And I wrote an article, which I'm going to put a link in the chat afterwards, entitled, I think it was "Cloud Services Are Neither Products Nor Services." What I'm really arguing is that you don't look at it as a product and you don't look at it as a service. It sits in between those two categories. And I'm going to get to the practical impact of that in a second. I actually read somebody else put it differently. Cloud services are both products and services. And I think that's a legitimate way to say it too. We're somewhere in between. So what's the source of, why is this a source of trouble? So let's start out with the confusion between software as a service and other cloud services and on-premise software. What happens if you misunderstand which type of deal you're doing, which I see all the time from some of the largest companies in the world? What I see is people apply terms and basically a whole script that comes from the world of on-premise software licensing to software as a service deals, and that causes all kinds of problems. Let's start out with the most fundamental one, and I bet some of you have heard me talk about this. You don't need a license to software as a service. On-premise software, you need a license. The customer needs a license to reproduce the software. That's the fundamental thing in the deal. But with software as a service, there's nothing to license. The customer isn't getting a right to make a copy, nor is it getting any of the other rights of copyright holders. It can't modify the software, distribute the software, publicly perform, publicly display. Actually, those two are not really very germane to software deals. They're more about plays and the other kinds of things that copyright covers. Anyway, you don't need a software license. And in fact, it is a mistake for the vendor in particular to grant a license, to use the word license in its grant of rights to software as a service, because there's all kinds of implications to that. You don't want to be giving a copyright license. You don't want to be giving intellectual property rights that you can't define. There's concerns that you'll trigger copyleft obligations related to open source software in your system. There's bankruptcy concerns. There's all kinds of concerns. So mistake number one is people tend to put an on-premise software license into software as a service deals. Other mistakes. A software license, an on-premise software license, can be perpetual. It can just go on forever. A software as a service deal can't. It really doesn't make sense. You can grant legal rights and say, you have a right to reproduce our software, and that right lasts forever. The vendor doesn't have to do anything after that fact. But with software as a service, the vendor's taking on an obligation to host that software, to run computers, to maintain it, all kinds of things. You don't want to take on a forever obligation, and it's not likely that a court would enforce that. Another huge difference that's sometimes misunderstood between the two is about data. So in a software as a service deal, the customer's data is going to end up not on its own computers, on the vendor's computers. And that's because the customer isn't putting the software on its computers. The customer's running software using software running on the vendor's computers. And so if you don't recognize the distinction between the two, you won't address the right, truly vital data terms. Classically described a software as a service, an on-premise software deal doesn't need any data terms. There's no access to the data for the vendor. Send you some software and then we're done. Now you might need some data terms if there's maintenance and the vendor actually gets access to the data. But you don't have the level of concern that you would have if the vendor was hosting the data. There are all kinds of other issues that arise from not understanding the distinction between the two. You're going to draft obligations for one type of contract that really fit the other. There's going to be revenue recognition issues. You're going to have impasses in negotiation because you're talking past each other. There's also tax issues. I've testified in cases about taxes. Tax systems that are set up to have one type of tax for a product and another type for a service, and not being clear on which you're offering can make it very difficult to figure out what sort of taxes are applicable. All right, so that's the problem of confusing cloud services and other software as a service and other cloud services for on-premise software. What about professional services? They are also often confused for professional services. And again, it's that sort of unfortunate use of the term service and all the names that the industry settled on, early in this century, like software as a service. These are not professional services. These are not like deals for services. In a professional services deal, you probably have a statement of work that describes help that's going to be provided by humans. In a software as a service or other cloud service deal, you don't. You have an SLA, service level agreement, most likely, and it describes the technical requirements, the technical functionality of the system. In other words, in a software as a service deal or another cloud service deal, you need to focus in on technology, on what technology is going to do. That's not the case in a professional services deal. Professional services deal really work quite differently. In a professional services deal, you want your drafting to focus on what human beings are going to do. Now, you could have an obligation to create software in a professional services deal, and there you would get into things like technical specs. You'll create software that fits these specs, but you're again focusing on humans. You have different warranty needs. In a cloud services deal, you want to put in warranties about things like that the software will do what it's supposed to do. Functionality warranties, very much like in a on-premise software deal. In a professional services deal, that doesn't make a lot of sense. So again, you've got all kinds of confusion that you can create. And of course, I shouldn't leave out the biggest one. If you're not clear on the difference between professional services and cloud services, you might get the data terms right. Professional services, there's no necessary access to any data. A human being is going to provide some services. In a cloud services deal, there is almost always access to data. So that's the two areas of confusion. The way cloud services get confused with and blended in with on-premise software license on the one hand and professional service on the other hand. Couple of points to make about that before we move forward. One is I noticed there was a comment asking, well, it said not to use a license for on-premise software. What should we do? Particularly if you're the vendor, scrupulously avoid that word license. Instead, I like to use the word subscription. I mean, the grant clause says very simply, during the term or during the subscription period, customer may access and use the software as a service. Customer may access and use the system. It's not a license. And by avoiding that word license, we avoid all kinds of potential legal troubles. So that's one simple way to do this better. And that article that I mentioned is going to point out lots of other ways. The other thing to be aware of, just so we don't generate confusion, is that there are such things as combination deals. You may be thinking, well, wait, our software as a service also has some downloaded software. The way to look at it is this. Yes, plenty of deals involve both software as a service and on-premise software, or all three: professional services, software as a service, on-premise software, because the vendor's doing lots of different things. You've kind of got to look at it as three different contracts in one. You have to track what are the terms needed for each type of deal. So that's the thing to be aware of. All right, so I've talked about the main source of confusion. Let's talk about the fourth type of deal: non-tech offerings delivered through technology. And the question, well, what sorts of mistakes surround them? And it's, our problem is they are often mistaken for any one of the other three. So, a system like LinkedIn, it's not software as a service. It's not really about the software. Yes, the software is central to LinkedIn. Technology is making it possible for us to network with each other on LinkedIn, for us to market to each other on LinkedIn. But ultimately, if you're drafting a contract, and I doubt you're drafting contracts with LinkedIn, but if you're drafting a contract for one of these sort of fourth category offerings, you need to be focused in not just on the technology, but on the outcome. If you're working on a contract and all you can see is the technology, and what's really being purchased is marketing services or data, or consumer goods, or whatever the real offering is, you're going to miss all kinds of things that are important to that transaction. So if you're, working on a system that has a, networking and communications opportunities between people, you need to think in your contract about the interactions between people and the impact of that on your deal, and on things like acceptable use policies and how people are going to treat each other, and indemnities and liabilities that surround that. And while the concerns about technology don't go away, because you're using technology in this system, and you may need tech-related protections like warranties that it'll work, and IP indemnities and stuff like that, that's the second thing that you want to look at. The first thing that you want to look at is, what is the real product or service being bought here, and what's the impact of that on this deal, and what does this deal need to say about it? And we run into some of the same mistakes in deals like this as in software as a service deals. For instance, the vendor of one of these fourth category non-tech offerings granting a license to its software. Really don't want to do that. Again, you're just granting access. Or really, you're saying you can have access to our marketing system. You can have access to our library of entertainment videos, like in the case of I'm blanking on the name of the world's most famous video entertainment system. But anyway, you could have a license to, you could have a right to one of these other products or services, and yet you're focusing on the technology. Or to take a really important example, Data as a service, DaaS. You're not buying technology there. You're buying, for instance, a flow of data that is about, financial issues or whatever it might be. And you want to make sure that you focus your contract terms on the data and on addressing what it's supposed to be because it's the real product, and recognize that the technology is just a means to an end. Someone put up a comment, Netflix, question mark. Yes, for some reason I couldn't come up with the name Netflix. That was the name I was looking for. That's another one of these edge of industry offerings. They provide entertainment, they provide videos, they don't provide technology. Technology is the means to the end. So long story short, let's return to where we started. We have four types of deals. We have on-premise software license agreements. And that's a deal where the customer gets the software. And you got to think through all the issues that come with that. Particularly, what are the copyright rights? What are the restrictions that you need? You got to recognize that when the relationship ends, the customer still is holding the software. It doesn't automatically disappear the way it does in a software as a service deal where the vendor can just turn it off. On-premise software, it's got to have terms that say give it back. There's all these implications to the difference between on-premise software and software as a service because the customer is holding the software. Category number 2, professional services. Should be simple. Services by people. Lawyers provide professional services. Doctors, janitors, these are all professional services. It's services by people. That's not like software as a service. Software as a service, you could call it services by computers. I just think you get yourself too messed up, and you have to recognize the very weak application of the word services here. And actually, some people call software as a service, platform as a service, they call it hosted software. And that might be more accurate. You'd say there's elements of a service. It basically focuses you in on the software. But anyway, software as a service, platform as a service, infrastructure as a service, other forms of cloud services. This is where the vendor holds the technology and the customer never gets its hands on it. And then fourth category, edge of industry, in a way the most different from all the others because you're not providing technology. You're just providing this other product, data or networking or entertainment, like in the case of Netflix. But in a way, they're very similar to cloud services deals because at least for the issues that surround the operation of the technology that's going to make the product or service available, they look a lot like cloud services. They certainly don't look like professional services. They certainly don't look like on-premise software. So that is our 4. That's the distinction. So, and that brings us to the end. I want to, just a couple other thoughts. First of all, we address this issue in our master classes, and you can see the scroll there at the bottom of the screen about the next series of master classes, which starts April 18th. And in fact, almost any time I'm teaching about technology, this issue of understanding which type of deal you're doing flows all the way through the course because in almost, in half the clauses, this is a relevant concern, the need to know what type of deal. So anyway, this comes up in the next series of master classes in many ways. So if you're interested in that, you can sign up online at techcontracts.com. As I said, that starts on April 18th. We also do in-house training, similar types of trainings, but just for the legal department or the contract managers or the business development people or whoever it might be. We do webinars and we have all kinds of other resources available at techcontracts.com. So if you want to learn more, that will be available to you too. So thank you very much for joining. And I will look forward to the next time we do this. Thanks a lot. Bye.
If you found this video useful, please come check out Tech Contracts Academy. We provide training on drafting and negotiating contracts about artificial intelligence, cloud computing, and other forms of software. It's all for lawyers, contract managers, and any business people involved with contracts. So please come check out our programs live and on demand at techcontracts.com.